Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are looking at what has to be one of the most fascinating diplomatic maneuvers of the entire 20th century. We're going to explore exactly how two island nations, sitting at completely opposite ends of the massive Eurasian landmass, came together to fundamentally alter global history. It's an incredible story of shifting power balances, desperate behind-the-scenes diplomacy, and military triumphs that literally echoed right across the oceans.
Okay, let's dive into this, because I want to start with a geopolitical mystery that perfectly frames our whole topic. Picture this. Right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, on the island of Malta, which was historically a really crucial hub for the British Royal Navy, there sits a solemn memorial, and it's dedicated to the fallen crew members of a Japanese naval destroyer. So you have to ask yourself, how on earth did Japanese sailors end up fighting and sacrificing their lives in European waters? Well, to understand that, we actually have to wind the clock way back to the late 19th century.
Section 1. Splendid Isolation and the Russian Threat. So, right after the 1895 Sino-Japanese War, the global chessboard shifted dramatically. The Russian Empire was expanding its reach incredibly fast southward, forming an alliance with France and aggressively hunting for ice-free ports. Get this, after forcing Japan to hand back the Liaodong Peninsula, Russia completely reversed course by 1898 and just militarily occupied Port Arthur for itself. Then, using the chaos of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 as a handy excuse, Russia essentially placed the entirety of Manchuria under military occupation. This immense, rapid pressure threatened the very survival of a newly modernizing Japan. But you know who else it terrified? The British Empire. Britain was finding itself dangerously overstretched at the time, especially with the ongoing Boer War in South Africa. The sheer speed of this Russian aggression threatened to cripple vital Asian trade routes, forcing London to a really harsh realization. Their famous, long-standing policy of splendid isolation was no longer a viable strategy. Standing completely alone was simply getting too dangerous.
Meanwhile, back in Tokyo, the government was experiencing intense diplomatic anguish. They were deeply divided on how to handle the Russian giant on their doorstep. You had prominent figures like Ito Hirobumi, desperately seeking a path of compromise with Russia, really hoping to just divide spheres of influence and avoid a catastrophic war. But on the other side, leaders like Yamagata Aritomo argued that conflict with Russia was absolutely inevitable. They believed that the only way Japan would survive was by allying with the world's preeminent naval power, Great Britain.
Moving to Section 2. The Alliance Forged and the Russo-Japanese War.
Ultimately, all those attempts to negotiate a compromise with Russia totally failed, and the pro-Britain faction won the debate in Tokyo. When the first Anglo-Japanese alliance was officially signed in London on January 30th, 1902, the Japanese public absolutely erupted in lantern-lit celebrations. People were thrilled and honestly incredibly proud to be recognized as a diplomatic equal by a Western superpower. And the treaty itself, it contained this brilliantly calculated clause. It stated that if either Britain or Japan went to war with a single nation, the other ally would stay strictly neutral. But if a second nation joined that war against the ally, the other partner was obligated to jump in and provide active military support. So the crucial point is, when the Russo-Japanese War broke out just 2 years later in 1904, this exact clause effectively paralyzed France. Since France was allied with Russia, joining the fight against Japan would immediately trigger Britain's entry into the war against France. It was a masterstroke.
And while Britain officially remained neutral in that Russo-Japanese War, their covert support was absolutely staggering. They were feeding Japan vital intelligence, and they practically crippled the Russian Baltic Fleet's long journey to Asia simply by denying them access to key ports like the Suez Canal. But perhaps most importantly of all, the British financial markets threw their doors wide open. London banks stepped up and underwrote massive loans that funded Japan's war effort, playing an indispensable role in Japan eventually defeating a massive continental power.
Section 3. Evolution and Shifting Target Nations. Because, as we know, international politics never really stands still.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the alliance rapidly evolved once the immediate threat of Russia was neutralized. The first treaty back in 1902 focused strictly on East Asia and was largely a defensive setup. But look at the second treaty in 1905. The scope expands all the way to India to protect British colonial interests, and it shifts into a full offensive-defensive pact, meaning if either nation was attacked by even one enemy, the other would join the fight. However, by the time we get to the third treaty in 1911, the global landscape had completely shifted again. Britain and the United States were actually growing much closer, so to ensure Britain wouldn't get dragged into a potential war against America as US-Japan tensions started rising in the Pacific, a crucial new clause was added that effectively excluded the United States from the alliance's target list.
Section 4. World War I and the Mediterranean's Fierce Battles.
When World War I broke out in 1914, Japan honored the alliance right away and joined the Allied powers. At first, they swiftly dismantled German naval bases and territorial holdings over in the Pacific and China. But as the war really dragged on and Allied shipping faced absolute devastation from German and Austrian U-boats, Britain made a desperate request. Overcoming their initial hesitation about deploying forces all the way to Europe, Japan sent the 2nd Special Task Fleet right into the Mediterranean. Stationed out of Malta, these Japanese warships escorted an astonishing 788 Allied ships. To put that into perspective, they ensured the safe passage of roughly 700,000 troops and rescued over 7,000 people from torpedoed vessels.
The bravery of these Japanese crews quickly became legendary. For example, on May 3, 1917, the British troop ship SS Transylvania was torpedoed. Now, despite the very active threat of further U-boat attacks, which was a nightmare scenario where standard naval protocol often meant abandoning the area just to avoid secondary strikes, the Japanese destroyers Matsu and Sakaki rushed straight in. They managed to rescue approximately 1,800 troops and nurses. Tragically, just over a month later, the Sakaki herself was struck by an Austrian torpedo, resulting in the heartbreaking loss of 59 crewmen. And that right there resolves the mystery we started with. This is exactly why that memorial stands in Malta today.
The heroism of those sailors represented the absolute zenith of this alliance. This quote here from King George V and the British Admiralty praising the unparalleled bravery of the Japanese officers, that wasn't just standard diplomatic politeness, it was a reflection of deep, genuine gratitude for what was literally a vital military lifeline.
Section 5. Power balance shift and dissolution. So the end of World War I fundamentally rewired the global power structure. The empires of old were completely exhausted. The United States had emerged as a dominant global superpower, and the newly formed League of Nations was trying to replace these secret bilateral military pacts with transparent collective security. In this brand new world, the exclusive Anglo-Japanese alliance was viewed with intense suspicion. At the 1921 Washington Naval Conference, Washington exerted immense pressure to dismantle the pact because they were deeply concerned about curbing Japan's expanding influence in the Pacific. Facing growing opposition to the treaty even from within their own borders, Britain and Japan eventually agreed to replace their bilateral alliance with a broader but significantly weaker four-power treaty involving the US, Britain, France, and Japan.
The emotional and strategic toll of this decision was incredibly heavy. Just listen to this quote from Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary at the time. "To destroy an alliance that has endured for 20 years and 2 great wars is hard to bear." He fully recognized the cruel diplomatic dilemma they were in. Keeping the alliance would alienate the rising United States, but breaking it would isolate their most steadfast partner in the East. Ultimately, in August 1923, the Anglo-Japanese alliance officially expired.
Which brings us to our final section, merits, demerits, and a modern legacy. As we look back, evaluating the historical weight of this pact is really quite complex. Let's objectively break down this legacy. On one hand, the merits for Japan are undeniable, right? The alliance provided the strategic backing and the financial capital needed to survive the Russo-Japanese War, and it elevated Japan to the status of a major global power during World War I. But on the other hand, the demerits are pretty stark. The alliance facilitated Japan's imperial expansion into Korea and mainland China. Furthermore, the eventual dissolution of the pact left Japan feeling diplomatically isolated throughout the 1920s and 30s, which tragically set the stage for a devastating conflict with the United States and its former British ally.
But history has a funny way of rhyming, doesn't it? Exactly 100 years after the alliance formally expired in 1923, we arrive at 2023. Japan and the UK signed the Reciprocal Access Agreement and the Hiroshima Accord, streamlining their military cooperation to a degree we haven't seen in a century. Driven by shifting power balances and entirely new geopolitical pressures in the Indo-Pacific, the British Prime Minister's office even referred to this as their most important defense agreement since the original 1902 alliance. It's a massive reunion. Which leaves us with this final thought. We've seen how the rapid expansion of a major land power forced 2 island nations to unite over a century ago. Today, as global power shifts once again, are we witnessing the dawn of a new Anglo-Japanese alliance? Because understanding the intricate chess moves of the past isn't just about learning history, it's really the only way to read the board as it's being played today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.